Picture this. You're a 12-year-old boy standing at the window of a stone tower in London, watching the summer sun set over the Thames in the year 1483. Your name is Edward, and until 3 months ago, you were the King of England. Your father, the most powerful man in the realm, died suddenly, and the crown passed to you. Now you're here, in the Tower of London, supposedly awaiting your coronation. Your younger brother Richard, just 9 years old, arrived yesterday to keep you company. You play games together, practice your Latin, and wait for the day when you'll be crowned. But as the days stretch into weeks, fewer servants attend to you. The rooms grow quieter. Your uncle, who promised to protect you, hasn't visited in days. And then one morning, you wake up and realize something has changed. The guards won't meet your eyes. And what happened to these two boys represents one of history's most chilling mysteries. A crime so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it would haunt England for centuries and remains unsolved to this day. Before diving into this forgotten story of power, betrayal, and two children who simply vanished, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand what happened to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, you must first understand the world that consumed them. A world where children were pawns in a deadly game of thrones, where family ties meant nothing against the intoxicating pull of power, and where murder could be disguised as statecraft. England in 1483 was a kingdom barely recovering from 3 decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had torn the nobility apart, pitting cousin against cousin, brother against brother, in a savage struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster for the English throne. By April 1483, it seemed the bloodshed had finally ended. Edward IV, a towering figure who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, had secured the throne for the House of York. He had ruled for over 20 years, crushing his enemies, executing rivals, and building a stable kingdom for his sons to inherit. He had married Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of extraordinary beauty but common birth, and together they had produced 2 sons who would continue the York dynasty. But Edward IV had a secret. For years, his massive frame had been slowly failing. He ate too much, drank too heavily, and by his early 40s, his health was collapsing. On April 9, 1483, after a brief illness that seemed to come from nowhere, Edward IV died. He was only 40 years old. In his final hours, gasping for breath in his bed at Westminster Palace, he made his younger brother Richard swear an oath. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was to become Lord Protector of England. He was to guard the king's sons, raise them, and ensure that 12-year-old Edward would be crowned when he came of age. Richard placed his hand on the Bible and swore he would protect the boys with his life. Richard of Gloucester wasn't born a monster. In fact, for most of his life, he had been known as the most loyal man in England. While other nobles had betrayed Edward IV during the wars, Richard had stood firm. He had fought in brutal battles, governed the turbulent north with surprising fairness, and earned a reputation for justice. He was slight, shorter than his brother, and contemporary accounts suggest he may have had one shoulder higher than the other, though this was likely subtle rather than the grotesque deformity Shakespeare would later invent. He was married, had a son of his own, and by all accounts seemed to love his brother deeply. Those who knew him in the north said he was stern but fair, the kind of man who actually listened to commoners' grievances and rendered impartial judgments. But something had always simmered beneath Richard's loyalty, a quiet resentment that his birth order had denied him the throne. He was the 3rd surviving son, always in the shadow of his magnificent older brother. He had done everything right, sacrificed everything, and his reward was to watch from the sidelines while Edward wore the crown. Now, with Edward dead and his nephew just a boy, Richard would serve as Lord Protector, but never as king. Unless something changed. Young Edward V was at Ludlow Castle in Wales when messengers arrived with news of his father's death. The boy had been sent there to learn kingship, to understand governance, surrounded by tutors and loyal servants appointed by his father. He was, by all accounts, a bright child, well-educated, fluent in Latin, and aware of the responsibilities that awaited him. When he heard his father was dead, witnesses say he wept bitterly. He understood what this meant. At 12 years old, Edward was now King of England. His mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, immediately sensed danger. She knew the court despised her. The nobles had never forgiven Edward IV for marrying a commoner, a widow with children from a previous marriage, instead of forming a strategic alliance with a foreign princess. They whispered that she had bewitched the king, used sorcery to trap him. Her family, the Woodvilles, had grown enormously powerful during Edward's reign, and this had bred intense jealousy among the old nobility. Now, with Edward dead, Elizabeth understood that her sons would need protection not just from foreign enemies, but from enemies within England itself. She sent word to her brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who was with young Edward at Ludlow. "Bring the king to London immediately," she commanded. "Bring him with an army. Make sure he's safe." But what Elizabeth didn't know was that Richard had already made his move. As young Edward's party travelled toward London in late April 1483, Richard intercepted them at Stony Stratford, about 50 miles northwest of the capital. Richard arrived with armed men and a smile. He greeted his nephew warmly, knelt before him as the new king, and insisted that he personally would escort Edward the rest of the way to London. Then, before anyone could protest, Richard arrested Anthony Woodville and several other of Edward's companions, accusing them of plotting to exclude him from power. Young Edward watched as the men who had protected him his entire life were dragged away in chains. He was now alone with his uncle. When Edward objected, Richard spoke to him gently but firmly. This was necessary, he explained. There were dangerous men trying to control the young king. Richard was only doing his duty as Lord Protector. "Trust me," Richard said, looking into the boy's frightened eyes. "I swore to your father I would protect you." On May 4th, 1483, Edward V entered London, riding beside his uncle. But instead of being taken to Westminster Palace, where kings traditionally resided before their coronations, Edward was brought to the Tower of London. Now, in 1483, this wasn't automatically sinister. The Tower served many purposes. It was a royal residence, an armory, a treasury, and yes, a prison. Kings often stayed there before their coronations, but Edward seemed uneasy. According to Dominic Mancini, an Italian diplomat who was in London at the time and later wrote a detailed account, the boy appeared pensive and withdrawn. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Woodville had realized something was terribly wrong. When news reached her that Richard had arrested her brother and taken custody of her son, she didn't hesitate. She gathered her 5 daughters and her younger son, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Under medieval law, churches offered sanctuary. Even the king's soldiers couldn't legally drag someone out. Elizabeth knew she needed to hide. She had seen what happened in civil wars. She had watched Edward IV execute rivals without mercy. She understood that royal blood meant nothing when power was at stake. For weeks, she stayed in the abbey with her children, sleeping in cramped rooms, terrified of what would happen next. Outside, Richard was consolidating power. He had himself declared Lord Protector formally, took control of the royal treasury, and began replacing Edward's councillors with his own supporters. Young Edward remained in the tower, and witnesses reported that the boy seemed increasingly isolated. Fewer people were allowed to visit him. His servants were replaced with Richard's men. Then came the day that would change everything. On June 16, 1483, Archbishop Thomas Bourchier arrived at Westminster Abbey with a message for Elizabeth Woodville. "Your younger son must leave sanctuary," he told her. "The coronation is approaching, and Edward needs his brother with him. It's not proper for the king to be alone." Elizabeth refused. She held her 9-year-old son close and said absolutely not. She knew that once both boys were in Richard's custody, she would have no leverage left. But the Archbishop was insistent. He gave her his personal guarantee that young Richard would be safe. He was, after all, a man of God. How could she refuse the Archbishop of Canterbury? What makes this moment particularly disturbing is that Elizabeth had no real choice. Richard could have simply violated sanctuary and taken the boy by force, and Elizabeth knew it. Medieval sanctuary was only as strong as the people in power allowed it to be. So, with tears streaming down her face, Elizabeth Woodville kissed her youngest son goodbye. 9-year-old Richard was confused. Why was his mother crying? He was going to see his brother. That was good, wasn't it? He was taken to the tower where Edward waited. The two boys were reunited. They had no idea they would never see their mother, their sisters, or the world beyond those stone walls again. For a brief moment, London seemed to return to normal. The coronation was scheduled for June 22nd. Preparations were made. Westminster Abbey was decorated. Nobles arrived from across England to witness the crowning of Edward V. But 3 days before the coronation, Richard made his boldest move yet. On June 19th, he ordered the execution of Anthony Woodville, the boy's uncle, along with several other Woodville supporters. They were beheaded at Pontefract Castle in the north, given no trial, no chance to defend themselves. Richard simply declared them traitors and had them killed. This was the man who had been traveling with young Edward, who had been appointed by Edward IV himself to educate and protect the young king. He was executed for the crime of being loyal to his nephews. Then came an announcement that shook England to its core. On June 22nd, the day that was supposed to be Edward's coronation, Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had never been valid. He claimed that before marrying Elizabeth, Edward had been betrothed to another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. Under medieval law, a betrothal was as binding as a marriage, which meant Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was bigamous. And if Edward's marriage was invalid, that meant his children were illegitimate. Bastards. They had no claim to the throne. Parliament, thoroughly intimidated by Richard and his armed supporters, quickly agreed. In a document known as Titulus Regius, they declared that Edward V and Richard were bastards, and therefore could not inherit the crown. And if Edward IV's sons were illegitimate, then the throne passed to the next legitimate male heir, Richard of Gloucester. The speed and efficiency of this was breathtaking. In less than 3 months, Richard had gone from loyal brother and uncle to King Richard III. His coronation was scheduled for July 6, 1483. And locked in the tower were 2 boys, who, according to Richard, were no longer princes, but merely the bastard sons of a dead king, with no importance and no future. What you're about to hear next happened in almost complete secrecy. This is where the mystery deepens, where history blurs into speculation and nightmare. Because after Richard's coronation, something terrible happened to those 2 boys, and exactly what occurred has haunted historians for over 500 years. In the weeks following Richard's coronation, people reported seeing the 2 boys playing in the gardens of the tower. They were spotted shooting arrows, playing ball, running along the walls. But as summer progressed, these sightings became less frequent. The boys appeared at the windows less often. Then, in late August or early September 1483, they simply disappeared. No one saw them again. No announcement was made, no explanation given. They were there one day and gone the next, as if they had simply been erased from existence. Dominic Mancini, the Italian visitor who had been observing events closely, wrote that he saw young Edward at the windows less and less, and that the boy's face showed signs of extreme sadness. Mancini noted that Edward seemed to anticipate his fate, spending his time in prayer, confessing his sins daily as if preparing for death. Then Mancini left England in mid-July to return to France, and when he inquired months later about what had happened to the boys, no one could tell him, or no one would. The silence from the tower was deafening. Elizabeth Woodville, still in sanctuary, must have gone mad with fear. She had no information. Her sons had simply vanished. She sent desperate messages, trying to get word of whether they were alive, but received no answers. In October 1483, just 3 months after Richard's coronation, rebellions broke out across southern England. Multiple nobles rose up against Richard, and their battle cry was telling. They demanded the restoration of Edward V. This suggests they believed, or at least hoped, that the boys were still alive. But Richard crushed these rebellions with brutal efficiency, and still, he made no statement about his nephews. He didn't parade them in public to prove they were alive. He didn't announce their deaths. He said nothing at all. This silence was perhaps the most damning evidence against him. If the boys had died of natural causes, illness, accident, Richard would have announced it immediately and given them a public funeral. Medieval kings understood the importance of proper burials for legitimacy, but Richard's silence suggested something else entirely. It suggested that he didn't want anyone asking questions about how two healthy boys, locked in the most secure fortress in England, had suddenly ceased to exist. By early 1484, rumours were spreading across Europe. Whispers in royal courts suggested that Richard had murdered his nephews. These weren't just random gossip. They were being repeated by diplomats, foreign rulers, and English exiles who had fled Richard's regime. In January 1484, the French Chancellor Guillaume de Rochefort publicly accused Richard of killing the princes. This was a diplomatic bombshell. Foreign governments were openly calling the King of England a child murderer, and still, Richard said nothing to defend himself. He never produced the boys, never offered proof they were alive, never even addressed the rumours directly. Think about what Richard's silence meant for Elizabeth Woodville. She was a mother who had been forced to give up her sons, who had watched them disappear into the tower, and who now heard rumours that they had been murdered. She had no bodies to bury, no closure, no certainty. She could only imagine what their final moments were like. Did they know what was coming? Did they call for her? Did they die together or separately? Did it happen quickly? Or did they suffer? These questions tormented her for the rest of her life, and she would never have answers. What followed Richard's reign was a descent into paranoia and fear. He knew people suspected him. He knew his legitimacy was questioned. He began executing potential rivals with increasing frequency. His own wife, Queen Anne, died suddenly in March 1485. Some whispered that Richard had poisoned her so he could marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, the prince's older sister, to strengthen his claim. Richard was forced to publicly deny these rumours, which shows how toxic his reputation had become. He was ruling through fear, but fear alone cannot sustain a kingdom. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a young man was gathering an army. His name was Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the House of Lancaster, with an extraordinarily weak claim to the throne. Under normal circumstances, Henry would never have had a chance at becoming king, but Richard had made himself so hated, had raised so many questions about his nephew's fate, that English nobles were willing to support almost anyone who could remove him. Henry promised that if he won the crown, he would marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York, and finally ending the Wars of the Roses. What he didn't promise was any investigation into what had happened to her brothers. On August 22nd, 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army. Richard marched to meet him, and they clashed at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard, despite all his flaws, was no coward. When he saw Henry's banner across the battlefield, Richard made the decision to charge directly at his rival, hoping to end the battle with a single decisive strike. He fought his way through Henry's bodyguards, killing several men with his own hands, getting within feet of Henry himself. But then Richard's horse became bogged down in marshy ground. Enemy soldiers surrounded him. They pulled him from his horse. According to accounts, Richard died fighting, his crown rolling into a bush as he was cut down, the last king of England to die in battle. When the fighting ended, Henry Tudor was proclaimed King Henry VII. He had won his throne through conquest, but his claim was paper thin, and he knew it. He needed legitimacy. So he married Elizabeth of York as promised. And then he did something very calculated. He didn't make finding out what happened to the princes a priority. He didn't launch a major investigation. He didn't accuse Richard posthumously of murder in any formal legal proceeding. Why? Because Henry understood something crucial. The mystery of the princes actually helped him. If they were dead, Henry was king through his wife's claim as Edward IV's daughter. But if they were somehow still alive, they had a better claim than he did. Better to let the mystery remain unsolved. But there was one man who wouldn't let the story die. His name was Sir James Tyrrell, and what happened to him reveals perhaps the darkest chapter of this entire saga. Tyrrell had been a loyal supporter of Richard III, serving as one of his closest attendants. He had fought for Richard at Bosworth and somehow managed to retain some position under Henry VII afterward. In 1502, nearly 20 years after the princes disappeared, Tyrrell was arrested for treason. He had apparently been plotting to help another pretender to the throne. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same building where the princes had vanished. And then, according to official reports, Tyrrell confessed to murdering the princes on Richard III's orders. The confession, as recorded by Tudor historians, described in disturbing detail how Tyrrell and two other men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, had been ordered by Richard to kill the boys. They waited until the princes were asleep in their beds. The assassins entered the chamber quietly, holding pillows. They smothered both boys simultaneously, pressing the pillows over their faces until they stopped struggling. The bodies were then buried at the foot of some stairs within the tower, hastily and without ceremony. Tyrrell described how the boys had clung to each other in their final moments, how their bodies had gone limp, how afterward he felt such horror at what he had done that he could barely look at himself. After giving this confession, Tyrrell was beheaded on May 6, 1502. But here's what makes this confession deeply suspect. There's no original document. Everything we know about Tyrrell's confession comes from accounts written later by Tudor historians, particularly Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil, who were writing under Henry VII and his son Henry VIII. These were not neutral observers. They were employed by the Tudor dynasty, which had every reason to paint Richard III as a monster to justify their own seizure of power. More's account, written decades after the events, reads more like a dramatic play than a historical document. He includes dialogue he couldn't possibly have known, describes the killer's thoughts and feelings, and paints Richard as essentially pure evil from birth. Modern historians have serious questions about this confession. Why did it take 19 years for Tyrrell to confess? Why was he never charged with the murders until he was already facing execution for a completely different crime? Why did Henry VII, who spent his reign obsessively securing his dynasty against any threats, never put Tyrrell on trial for the murders when it would have definitively proven Richard's guilt? And most tellingly, why is there no contemporary document of the confession? No transcript, no signed statement, nothing but second-hand accounts written years later by men who served the Tudors. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened. But in 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes vanished, workers were demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London. Beneath the stairs, they found a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of two children. The bones were jumbled together, suggesting they had been buried hastily, and the location matched Tyrrell's alleged confession. King Charles II, ruling at the time, declared these must be the princes. He had them reburied in Westminster Abbey in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren, with an inscription stating definitively that these were Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, murdered by Richard III. But were they really? In 1933, the bones were briefly examined by experts. The examination was rushed and limited. The scientific techniques available in the 1930s were primitive compared to today. The experts concluded the bones were from two children, roughly the right ages, and that one skull showed evidence of a blood disease that one of the princes had suffered from. But the examination was not thorough enough to be conclusive. Many historians have called for modern DNA testing. Elizabeth Woodville's remains have been identified, and DNA comparison would settle the question once and for all. But the British royal family has repeatedly refused to allow the bones in Westminster Abbey to be disturbed. So the mystery persists. What makes this particularly haunting isn't just that two children may have been murdered, it's that we don't know for certain. Several alternative theories exist, each with its own evidence and problems. Some historians suggest that the boys were killed, but not by Richard. Perhaps they died on Henry VII's orders after Bosworth, because living princes were too dangerous to his weak claim. This would explain why Henry never pushed the issue, and why the confession emerged only 19 years later. Others propose that one or both boys survived, possibly smuggled out of England by sympathetic supporters. This theory gained traction because several pretenders claiming to be one of the princes emerged in the 1490s, most notably Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury and gained support from several European monarchs before being captured and executed by Henry VII. There's even a theory that the boys died of natural causes, perhaps from illness, and that Richard simply covered it up poorly because the timing looked so suspicious. In an age when child mortality was high, even among royalty, this isn't impossible. But Richard's complete silence, his refusal to produce bodies or hold funerals, makes this hard to believe. If they had died naturally, he could have used their deaths to strengthen his claim. He could have displayed their bodies, held elaborate funerals, and demonstrated his grief. Instead, he acted like a man with something to hide. The psychological impact on Elizabeth Woodville and her remaining children was devastating. She eventually emerged from sanctuary, reached an agreement with Henry VII, and lived to see her daughter become queen. But she was never the same. She had lost two sons, her brother, her power, and her place in the world. By the standards of her age, she had once been one of the most powerful women in Europe, a commoner who became queen, whose beauty and intelligence had captivated a king. Now she was a broken woman who had outlived her sons and could never know what became of them. She died in 1492 at Bermondsey Abbey, having spent her final years in quiet poverty. Some historians suggest Henry VII deliberately impoverished her as punishment for some offense, but others think she simply withdrew from the world, unable to bear the pain of not knowing. Behind every historical narrative of royal power and medieval intrigue, there are individual human stories. Two boys who played games, studied Latin, and trusted that the adults around them would keep them safe. A mother who made an impossible choice and spent the rest of her life haunted by it. A kingdom that looked away because acknowledging what had happened was too terrible, too destabilizing. The princes in the tower represent something fundamental about power, that it corrupts not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small decisions, each one moving further from humanity, until murder becomes just another tool of statecraft. The Tower of London still stands today, exactly as it did in 1483. Tourists walk through its halls, take photographs, and learn about its history. The room where the princes may have been held is marked, though its precise location is debated. At Westminster Abbey, you can visit the marble urn containing the bones that might be theirs. The inscription is definitive, but the truth remains elusive. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, some people leave flowers at the urn, their mourning children who died over 500 years ago, whose story still has the power to break hearts. Perhaps most tragically, we'll never know who Edward and Richard truly were beyond their royal titles. Edward showed signs of intelligence and piety in his brief time as king, but he was only 12. Richard was just 9, barely more than a child. They never got the chance to grow up, to become men, to make their own choices or shape their own destinies. They were born into power they couldn't control, destroyed by ambitions they couldn't understand, and forgotten by a world that needed to move on. What we do know is that they were real people who experienced real fear, real confusion, and likely real terror in their final moments, whenever and however those moments came. The princes in the tower remind us that even across the vast gulf of 5 centuries, some human experiences remain universal. The fear of a child separated from their mother. The pain of a sibling watching their brother suffer. The horror of realizing that the people who were supposed to protect you are the ones you should fear most. The bones in Westminster Abbey, whether they belong to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, or to two other unknown children, are a monument to all children caught in the machinery of power, crushed by ambitions not their own, forgotten by history except as footnotes to someone else's story. Their names should be remembered not as a historical mystery to be solved, but as a reminder of the human cost of power, the price paid by the powerless, and the tragedy of innocence destroyed.